Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Wonderful to have you back here again in the afternoon after that little break. The morning session by all accounts was stupendous. I spent some part of it in Kitab Khana. We had wonderful response there. And of course, I understand this was a packed house here. So thank you so very much for supporting us in this way. This pioneering initiative of Maxcity VOW LitFest. Geopolitics themed LitFest that we are aiming to bring to Mumbai for the first time. Thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen. The afternoon session, we are calling it the Maritime Milestones. I'd like to first begin by saying that the Maritime History Society of Mumbai, in fact, of course, the country, is the Karta Dharta of this entire session from now until the end of the fireside chat. So I'm only as their good soldier for many years, trying to present this part in the afternoon. We have, ladies and gentlemen, 3 or 4 very, very captivating sessions, each touching upon a different aspect of India's maritime past. You have already seen the movie on naval uprising. And so very few people know about Mumbai's participation in that, So as I was telling in Kitab Khana, about 400 Mumbaikars, I'm not talking of the Royal Indian Navy people, 400 Mumbaikars died. It's about the same figure as people who perished in the Jallianwala Bagh. We must remember the Jallianwala Bagh, but we must also remember what happened here next door. So after that nice movie on the naval uprising, we are going to start with a talk by Sanjeev Sanyal on India and the Indian Ocean. That will follow with a session. You are in Bombay, Maharashtra. We can't forget the Marathas, the mighty Marathas, and we've got 2 outstanding, knowledgeable people on the Maratha Navy, Lieutenant Commander Uday Kulkarni, Sohail Rekhi, who's written this lovely book on Sarkhen Kanoji Hangre, in conversation with Colonel Ajay Singh, who's encyclopedic in his knowledge of military matters. That session is followed by a conversation with Sandeep Punnithan and S.K. Gupta sir, Rear Admiral S.K. Gupta, and that's going to be about Navy in the post-independence India, contributions to the Indian Navy, particularly the 71 war, leading up to this century. And in the fireside chat that I'll be having with Admiral S.J. Singh at the end of it, we're going to talk about the Indian Navy of the 21st century. So that is how we have structured this afternoon, right from ancient Harappan times possibly. I don't know what Sanjeev will cover, but until the 21st century Navy. So ladies and gentlemen, I don't think this audience needs an introduction to Sanjeev Sanyal. He's been here in the morning, he has spoken, you heard him, you heard about him. He's a man of many parts, obviously. A scholar, author, historian, member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. And he is what one might say, these are phrases which used to be loaded in earlier times, public intellectual, but I think he is the public intellectual of our times. He's contributed immensely to the national discourse that's happening. But one thing I'd like to flag, because it is the maritime session, many people forget about his role in enhancing India's maritime consciousness. I think his book, The Ocean of Churn, which got a lot of people talking, and it became a bestseller, and that's for the first time that the maritime stories of India came to be read widely by people. Subsequently, all his efforts on the maritime, of course, he speaks regularly. He's a part of the Navy's War College and Staff College, expert faculty. But he also has spoken in many public forums. His most recent initiative has been the stitched ship, an ancient ship. Now, just 2 days back, it was launched in Goa. So we must applaud that lovely venture of Sanjeev. Recreating India's maritime legacy and taking pride in it and articulating that in public culture. I think Sanyal deserves our collective accolades for doing that. And I would say, as a Navy man, as a maritime man, we're very, very happy and proud to have you as our unofficial spokesperson for a lot of things. So, with those words, ladies and gentlemen, I invite Sanjeev to talk. India and the Indian Ocean, all yours.
Thank you, Commodore Kisnu. Now that he has given me this rather rousing introduction, I will now have to live up to expectations. So it's not a lot of performance pressure now on me. So good afternoon, Mumbai. How are you doing? Good. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is something you can just see out if you go outside, which is the Indian Ocean. And as should be pretty obvious to anybody who's looked at a map, we are the only country in the world which actually has an ocean named after us. You know, America, after a lot of effort, has managed to name the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, but we have a full ocean. And that is well deserved, because India has perhaps the longest and most colorful maritime history in the world. But before I come to the history, let me say that I'm not just interested in history just for history's sake. My real interest in this is really to wake up India and Indians and Indian policymakers in particular from a landlocked view of the world. But you see, as a policymaker, this is a dangerous thing. India, from a geopolitical and economic perspective, is actually an island nation. We do have land borders. One of them is with a friendly neighbor to our northwest, and the other long one is with a friendly neighbor to our northeast. Now we do trade with China, but not with the bit that we have the land border with. So effectively, that's from an economic perspective a sealed border, and of course the one with Pakistan is also basically sealed. We do have some other land borders with small countries, but effectively, from a geopolitical and economic perspective, we are an island nation. If ever there was an economic, geopolitical, geostrategic incident, let me say that basically we will have to resupply ourselves from the sea. Now there is a problem here in that because of our sea blindness, we have simply not invested in our maritime sector for generations. And the result of this is that today 90% plus, almost 95% of our imports and exports are carried by foreign ships. 95%. After oil, shipping related costs, which is whether shipping, insurance, etc., which work out to be about $100 billion, is our second biggest import after oil. So this is not a trivial thing. A country our size has only got 480 workable ocean-going ships. I'm not taking into account fishing trawlers and so on, but serious ships for carrying our exports and imports. Only 480 of them. So, never mind global sanctions by major powers. If 3 or 4 major shipping lines decide they don't like us, our economy will be on its knees. So much so, I would consider it our single most important geostrategic risk. Which is a reason why you may have noticed, who read maritime shipping related stuff, that I have in the last couple of years made a lot of fuss about investing into ports, into shipbuilding in particular, and ownership and flagging of Indian ships. This is absolutely top of mind recall for the Honorable Prime Minister. And you may have seen in the recent budget, we have finally classified not just shipbuilding but ships, large ships, as infrastructure, which will mean that we can finally get them long-term loans, 30-year type loans, which is necessary for buying large ships. We will also be investing, as you know, just north of here in a very large port at Vadhavan. And that port, when it opens in a few years' time, will be the single largest port India has ever built. It will be larger than all our current ports put together. And we want to build another very significant port on our eastern ports in the not too distant future. There are, as we speak, 4 major laws, bills which are making, maritime related bills which are making their way through Parliament, which will also radically change ownership and flagging rules. There are 2 more in the pipeline relating to the SARFAESI Act and also the overall shipping related laws. So we will have, hopefully in 12 months' time, a completely radically changed legal ecosystem for our shipping industry. We will have done, we intend to create a lot of financing through a maritime fund so that money is not an issue. As I already said, we are making big changes in ownership, flagging, many other shipping related laws, policies and so on. And the idea is that we will move from our current position of insignificance in shipbuilding to becoming a major power. So just to tell you how insignificant we are today, 45% of all the ships today in the world are being built by one country, China. Then another 20% by Korea and about 25% by Japan. So those 3 combined produce 95% of the world's ships. We produce less than 0.5. And this is odd because actually we have every ingredient of being a major shipbuilding power. Of course, we have a long coastline, but we also have the technology. I mean, we are able to build nuclear subs, we are able to build technology, probably the most difficult thing to build, which is an aircraft carrier. But for some reason, we don't build oil tankers, which are actually not very complicated to build. We have the steel, we have the young men, and shipbuilding is a young man's business. Basically, it is millions of hours of welding. And again, this is something that the Koreans and the Japanese simply cannot sustain because of their demographics. They don't have the young men. It's basically about climbing up and down and putting plates and welding them. That's what shipbuilding is about. Hours and hours of this. And we have men, as I said, the technology, the steel, the coastline, the domestic demand for this. So the point I'm making here is, our aim is to make shipbuilding a major activity in the next 10 years to become a 3rd largest shipbuilding power in the next decade, which is a very big focus we have. And we will also try to do this. And of course, we have invested a lot in our Navy recently, as we may know. There are a lot of indigenous ships that have been commissioned recently. But there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't do this for foreign countries and our allies. Many of them want ships, but frankly, there is no way countries like Australia can build the ships they need. And we should think of ourselves as a country that produces at least the hulls for these countries, maybe even for America. Frankly, even America does not have the capabilities of building the hulls it needs. I mean, we can build the empty hulls, the shells, they can do whatever else they want, put in the software, missiles, whatever they want. But frankly, we could be the supplier of all of these things. So, very big thing that we want to do. Sorry for a long preface to what I'm going to talk about, but I want you to know that this is an important thing that we want to promote as a government and as a people. The tragedy is that we have ended up where we have. And as I said, this comes from a very landlocked view of ourselves in the world. And there are many reasons for this, maybe because our capital of all these years has been in Delhi, which is landlocked. Maybe because we never before had a prime minister from a coastal state. So, I don't know, I'm just guessing. although P.V. Narasimha Rao in those days would have been considered a coastal state because of the combined state of Andhra Pradesh. I'm just guessing why. But for the first time, we do have a serious interest at the highest levels in shipbuilding and ships. But the odd thing is, as I said right at the beginning, we do have perhaps the most colorful history of shipbuilding in the world. Going back all the way to the Bronze Age, to the Harappan ports in Gujarat. Now the Gujarat of that time looked very different from today. The sea levels were higher. What is now the Run of Kutch was the estuary of two major rivers, the Indus and of the Saraswati. And Saurashtra and Kutch were both islands. And so you could actually navigate through what is now the Run of Kutch. The salt flats, they were all basically the leftover of this estuary. When it dried up, it left this behind. And in the middle of all of that, there was this massive port, what we now know as Bolavira. But this place is today landlocked in the middle of the salt flats. But in fact, it was a major port. And there were two ways of getting to this port. One was the southern route, which was past Lothal, also now landlocked, but there is as everybody knows, there are these docks there. Now, Lothal, in my guess, was not a major port, contrary to what you are taught. If you go to Lothal, you will see the site is it's got a big docking area and some warehouses, but the urban settlement there is actually quite small. My sense is that it was actually a customs depot. For ships coming up the Konkan coast, they would probably stop there, get checked, get their stuff sealed, pay their bribes, whatever else they do in customs depots, and then made their way to Dolavira. And then there was another route, and that other route was through Dwarka. Dwarka literally means the gateway. The question is, what was it a gateway to? It was a gateway out towards the Persian Gulf, where there is lots of evidence of Indians coming there to trade. So all the way through to Mesopotamia, you have lots of Harappan seals and weights and measures and Sumerian tablets which talk about a people called the Meluha who came there to trade things which are clearly Indian. Things like peacock feathers and ivory and beads and so on. And in fact, there were large communities of Indians living there. So if you go to the Middle East and see lots of Indians there, they do remember that has always been the case. There is some mystery, however, what we imported in return. So we know what we were exporting, all these ivory, beads, etc., cotton cloth. But there is a controversy about what we imported because nothing of obvious Harappan origin has ever been found in any Harappan port, city or anything. It may be that we brought in things like copper from Oman. We certainly did bring some copper in. So obviously we then made it into other things. So therefore, we don't know. And the other guess, which is my guess, is that we used to import horses from them. Some horse remains have been found in one or two locations in Gujarat. But my own sense is that we have been importing Arabian horses for a long, long time. And in fact, this was the main source of horses into India, other than indigenous horses, and not from Central Asia. And this is a longer debate which I don't want to get into right now. Now, this world I described came to an end around about 2000 BC, that's 4,000 years ago. The climate changed, the sea levels fell, the Saraswati River dried up. And so, Dholavira was left marooned in the middle of the salt flats. But that didn't end India's links to the ocean. The Iron Age also sees many maritime cultures, and one of them emerged in eastern India, in the area between Lake Chilika and the westernmost outlet of the Ganga. This area, which is partly now in Bengal and partly in Odisha, this became home to large numbers of ports. And from there, from ports like Chandraketugad and Tamralipti and so on, merchants would set out to explore the coastline. And initially they were just going along the coastline. And that is how they came to settle, for example, in places like Sri Lanka. They went the other way, began to make their way to the Isthmus of Kra, that's the area, a bit of Thailand near Phuket, and so on and so forth. And over time, they learned something interesting, that the monsoon winds blow in one direction for part of the year and blow in the other direction for the other part of the year. Now this is a unique feature of monsoony climate because it means you can sail somewhere and then hope to come back. And then what happens is that you are able then to do something, which is to sail completely across the ocean. And so that's what, by certainly the first, second century BC, we begin to see Indian merchants turning up in the Red Sea and in Alexandria. They turn up in Southeast Asia. And then by the Gupta period, we certainly see Indians in large numbers turning up in places like in Southeast Asia, all the way through to Japan and Korea and so on. In fact, Korean history begins with the wedding of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. Just imagine. And that princess reached there by ship. So there are all these huge amounts of trade that goes back and forth. Now over this long period, there is lots of exchange. The result is, of course, that the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, it's in Cambodia, in Angkor Wat. The largest Buddhist site in the world is in Indonesia, Borobudur. And there's, of course, both Hinduism and Buddhism and Indian ideas or Indian mathematics, the game of chess, which went westward. All of these things are swirling around. It's not always a one-way traffic. There are many things we today consider quintessentially Indian, which are actually imports, like the business of eating pan. Both the leaf and the betel nut, the supadi, are actually not Indian but Southeast Asian. So there's a lot of to and fro. One of the greatest kings of southern India, Narasimhavarman II of the Pallava dynasty, is actually was partly of Cambodian or Malay origin. So there is a lot of people going back and forth, there's a lot of trade, ideas and so on. And of course, amidst all of that, there is geopolitics. So let's go back 1,000 years ago to the Chola period. What is going on in the Chola period? The world economy is based on trade between three major nodes. One of them is Egypt, then under the Fatimid dynasty. One of them is India, particularly southern India, which is then ruled by the Cholas. And of course, their rivals like the Chalukyas and so on. And then through Southeast Asia, where we have the Javans and the Sumatrans. The Sumatrans are at this time ruled by the great Srivijaya Empire. And then going all the way through to China, which is then under the Song Empire. So this is the node of trade. And what happens is, in the first decade of the 11th century, so about 1015 odd years ago, the Javans and the Sumatrans have a series of battles. By the way, most of Indonesian history is about the Javans and the Sumatrans not getting along. And typically what used to happen is that the Javans control the straits, the Sunda Straits, and the Sumatrans controlled the Straits of Malacca. So that was led to a healthy competition. So there was, you could choose which route you took. But what happens is that the Javans suddenly become powerful and they begin to push the Sumatrans out. So the Sumatrans reach out to the Chinese for help. And with the help of the Chinese, we are not quite sure how they help, maybe with money, maybe with technology, I don't know. But with the help of the Chinese, the Sumatrans, Srivijayas, push out the Javans. And for the first time, they controlled both the Sunda Strait and the Malacca Straits. And they do what all monopolists in Egypt do, which is they impose high tariffs on ships passing between India and China. Now Rajendra Chola, who was then ruling over the Chola Empire, he sent in 1017 a warning to the Srivijaya that this is a bad thing, you should not do this. But clearly the Srivijaya thought, who cares? So what happens is that in 1025 AD, that is exactly 1000 years ago, a very large fleet sets off from Nagapattinam, which was the Chola's main port, and basically goes first, we don't know exactly which direction they went, but my best guess is the following. They ended up in the Sunda Straits, which was, and got resupplied by the Javan allies, and then they made their way up the other side through the Malacca Straits, basically sacking all these Sumatran ports along the way, so like places like Palembang and other things. And then ultimately they attack Kedah or Kadaram and defeat the main army of the Srivijayas. And then they come back through the past Nicobar back. Now this massive raid then changed the geopolitics of that time, and of course established the Cholas as the dominant power. But it's very interesting what the Chinese did in a response to an attack on their ally. They did absolutely nothing. So we don't again know why it is the case, but we do know that there was a joint Chola Srivijaya embassy a few years later to the Song Emperor's court. It's quite possible that the Chinese were also quite unhappy with this monopolistic behavior of the Srivijaya Empire. So maybe they were quite happy that Rajendra Chola did what he did. We don't know, but that may be the possibility. Now again, this world that I have described, you have to remember, is not about a few kings and some heroic merchants going back and forth individually and trading. This is a very organized world of multinational guilds. So long before there were multinational companies like East India Company, there were multinational corporatized guilds from India that dominated the Indian Ocean. They had colorful names like the Fund 500. I'm assuming they had 500 shareholders, I don't know. Or Mani Gramam, which means the village of jewels. And they were basically corporatized guilds. They had their own armies. Many of the kings and emperors were rather scared of these guys because they were quite powerful. They, as I said, commanded their own navy. It's quite likely that the Chola raid was basically backed by the 500. They were, after all, the biggest beneficiaries of opening up the trade. And also, interesting is how they got financed. They were financed essentially by temple banks. So when you hear of these medieval Indian temples with a lot of gold, you may get this impression that they had a lot of gold because the emperors were all handing over their gold to these temples. Let me tell you that even in ancient times, it was very difficult to get Indian politicians to hand over their money to anyone. While it is true, the emperors did invest in large temples to glorify themselves and put large carvings and so on, the temples themselves made their money as venture capitalists and banks. So basically all this gold was essentially recycled to finance infrastructure and trade. And we have actually copper plate contracts that are survived in certain South Indian temples about how there were tripartite contracts between the temple financier, the merchant guild, which would trade these things, and the artisan guilds, which made whatever products they were making to sell it in international markets. So these were very organized systems, and you're talking about literally thousands of ships going back and forth, which is why it particularly irks me that India, gave up on its mercantile culture in recent times. Now, how much time do I have left? Do I have some time left, or should I?
No, you want to take questions or you?
I can take questions too. You tell me. You decide.
About 5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes more. Okay.
Couple of questions.
Okay, sure. So, what happens is the world that I just described also came to a cataclysmic end. What happens in the end of the 1100s and the early 1200s is that there are these series of Central Asian invasions into all these nodes of trade. The Mongols invade China and they basically sack the Song Empire. India is invaded by the Turks, who also sack these temples, which are critical. So it's basically all the financing system basically jams up. And of course the Mongols also raid Baghdad and Middle East, which is another node of trade. So all the major nodes of medieval trade are basically sacked and destroyed by these Central Asian marauders, and this world I described again falls apart. So as you can see, the Indian Ocean has gone through many cycles of ups and downs. But then after a while they recreate themselves, but not necessarily in the way they existed before. So after some short period of decline, in which, by the way, the Arabs come to dominate a lot of the trade, there is again a period of revival. And this period of revival really happens in its strongest form in China. So this is the early 1400s. India is still, by the way, quite disturbed, except in the extreme south where the Vijayanagara Empire is coming set up. The Middle East is also reasonably unsettled. But in China, we have a great empire again rising, the Ming. And after having settled things internally, they decide to begin to sort of project power abroad. And in many ways, they are like modern China. They are trying to re-establish China after a period of decline. They want to project power. And how do they project power? They build this massive fleet called the treasure fleet. And the treasure fleet was made up of a very large number of ships. It had as many as 20,000 sailors, not a trivial number, but large by even modern standards. And they had these massive ships which would have been 4 to 5 times the size of Columbus's or Vasco da Gama ships. So these are massive ships. They would have been considered, serious sized ships even by modern standards. And under this Admiral Zheng He, they make their way down the Chinese coast through Southeast Asia, where there is the Indonesians themselves have kind of come building another empire called the Majapahit, and they turn up in the Indian Ocean. Now, very important thing you must understand that this is not what some people try to show are voyages of exploration. Remember that India, China, and all these people have been trading with each other for thousands of years at this point. So all these routes they are taking are well known. So why are they here? They are here to trade, but more importantly, to project power. And so there are these series of voyages done by Admiral Zheng He, who incidentally was a eunuch as well. And so the eunuch admiral takes these ships, they come into the Indian Ocean, and they trade, but they also do geopolitical things. For example, they try to change the king of Sri Lanka. They interfere in the politics of the Kerala coast, and they raid Palembang, and they do various things. They try to outmaneuver the Indonesians. They do all kinds of things. And after a couple of voyages, it's quite clear that they are so far ahead technologically that even though they are quite far away, they basically have taken over the Indian Ocean. So if in the year 1430 you had asked anyone, in the next few centuries, naval power will dominate, who do you think it will be? Almost everybody would have said it's almost certainly the Chinese. Because the Chinese are so far ahead of everybody technologically, and they're already there, they've taken over the Indian Ocean, they are already taken over the South China Sea, and so, they are a real powerhouse. So this was how the world looked circa 1435 or thereabouts. Now, something interesting happened. The old Ming Emperor died, the one who backed Zheng He, and there is a new emperor. The new emperor comes to the throne backed by the Mandarin bureaucrats. And the Mandarin bureaucrats are very suspicious of the eunuch lobby in the court because they are their rivals and they were the favorites of the previous emperor. So, the Mandarins do what all good bureaucrats do when faced with a problem, they shut off the money. So the Chinese Navy never gets defeated. Instead, it rots in the port. It simply falls apart. The records of these great voyages by Zheng He are suppressed, and they do it so well that its memory fades, and it's only in the 20th century that finally those records are found and the sheer scale of these voyages is rediscovered. So even the Chinese begin to forget about how great these voyages were. So which brings me to one of the great lessons of history. Be always wary of bureaucrats. Now I've spoken for a long time, but before it is important that you understand the unintended consequences, how things emerge. Now here we are, somewhere in the second half of the 1400s. The Chinese came, they knocked everybody out, they established themselves as a great power. They still are, they have not completely disappeared, but they are rapidly losing their their ability for power projection. But frankly, there is nobody quite there. And for a little while, it seems maybe the Arabs, maybe the Majapahit, these guys are going to kind of take over the Indian Ocean. But in the last decade, in the 1490s, it is the Portuguese who turn up and take over the Indian Ocean. Now this is important because we may sometimes wonder, why is it that 3 ships with some Portuguese chaps from faraway places turned up and they had a few cannons, okay, but how is it that they were able to so quickly take over the Indian Ocean? And the reason for that is the Chinese had been there just before them and for internal reasons had withdrawn. So they had left behind a vacuum which the Portuguese were very easily able to take advantage of. So this is the real reason that the Portuguese were so able to do this so very quickly, because the Chinese had left behind a vacuum. So this is another lesson for our own times. Do not extrapolate current trends into the future. We have no idea what will exactly happen and who will end up being, potentially through unintended consequences of what the great powers of today do, who will end up becoming the great powers of the future. After all, who knew that the Portuguese, a sort of second-rate power in Europe, would end up dominating all of Asia? Who knew that? Which is why I keep a very close eye on New Zealand. With that, let me stop, and I'm happy to answer questions.
So a couple of questions, please.
Yeah, stand up, you can ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir.
You'll have to be a little loud, yeah?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned that we have around 480 ships which are ocean going. So I just wanted to understand, it's like those are Indian registered vessels or Indian flagged vessels? Because there is a difference between a registered vessel and a flagged vessel.
Indian owned vessels.
Okay. And if we have 480, what is the highest number? It's like where we are in the standings.
Not very high.
Okay.
I don't know the exact number, but by the way, many of these ships are nothing to write home about. Yeah? They're quite small ships.
And on the second part, it's like since we are focusing on shipbuilding, are we also concentrating our efforts on container building? Because that's the second part of the industry.
In fact, if you saw the conversation between our Prime Minister and President Macron just 2 weeks ago, they actually talk about this. About containers as well, because that is something where the Chinese have 90% of, almost 90% of all the containers in the world are now made in China. And so, again, not a high technology thing. We have the technology and capability of doing it. For whatever reason, we don't. And again, huge risk. Simply having control of the boxes in which things take around the world, and you control the whole system. Yes.
Sanjeev, can you revisit 2 facts that you sort of quoted? Fact number 1 is Indian Ocean's outside Mumbai. I sail off Portsmouth Harbour. That's not the Atlantic Ocean according to the English. The second is 45% of ships are made in China. The chap sitting next to me said the number is 60%.
So it depends on maybe the number has gone up, but it's a large number. You can see what I'm talking about. It doesn't change my point. As far as calling this the Arabian Sea, well, it's an outlet of, it's an inlet of the Indian Ocean. It's a part of the Indian Ocean world. It is an arbitrary European idea that these are separate. The Indian way of thinking about it is the Western Ocean and the Eastern Ocean. Yeah, so I have now answered questions on the left. Answer a few.
One minute.
Yeah,
Johnny, 1 minute.
Yeah.
So I have a query regarding the quote of users. What is its importance? Can that importance be revisited, leveraged for looking at the, since we are talking about container terminal, the Vizhinjam Island and the growth of that in the current
So Machilipatnam, or what the Europeans call Muzaris, was a very major port for almost more than 1,000 years. There is some debate about exactly where it was, but by and large it was somewhere in and around the area which is now known as Pattana. This is north of Kochi. There was a massive flood there, I forget in which year, 1300 something, and that destroyed that port. And after that, the port basically shifted, some part of the port shifted toward the Cochin area, and another part moved north to the Calicut area. So that port was essentially abandoned, and it got silted and other things. So the geography of that place after that big flood changed. So I don't think that particular port will work today. But it's not far from, it's in Cranganore, so which is just north of Kochi. So Kochi is today's Kochi.
My point is, sir,
Yeah.
in the world trade, maritime trade that happened that time,
Yeah.
Machilipatnam or Muzaris played a vital role because of its locations.
Absolutely.
Which
Yeah.
right now Colombo is in there. So
Yeah, yeah,
can
that's-
we leverage that substitution?
No, so absolutely, and there are many reasons why Colombo Port has, some of it is our own internal rules, some of which are slowly being changed. But I think one major thing that we need to do is simply to have serious, efficient deep water ports. Hopefully one being built in Vadhavan, but other ones as well. I mean, there is no reason why Mangalore or some of these other ports don't get upgraded very significantly. So you will see significant investments into our ports happening in the next few years. And you can see it yourself. It's not something I have to tell you. You are from this sector. You can see the amount of buzz about this sector has like dramatically gone up in the last couple of years. And I can take a little bit of credit for it as well. Yes, the lady there.
Please,
Yeah.
Johnny.
It's regarding the RIN pricing. Is it okay to ask?
Yeah, sure.
So the Indian Navy draws the analogy between the RIN pricing with regard to the people of Bombay and what happened in Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So it's not in the commemorative memory of the people of Bombay or India. So could you suggest like how it could be brought into the...
Yes, so absolutely. In fact, I have written extensively on the RIN mutiny in the context of another book, which is not a maritime book, but it's called The Revolutionaries. It's a book about the armed resistance to the British. And it's a different story of how India became free, in which the armed resistance is the main driving force of our freedom struggle. And the Gandhiji, Congress, etc. are at the periphery. This is not to suggest that Gandhiji didn't play any role in our freedom struggle, but just to say that there is another way of thinking about our freedom struggle, which looks and feels totally different. And the Royal Indian Navy mutiny that happened was in some ways the culmination of that story. Because you have to remember that many attempts had been made to have big revolts in the British Indian armed forces. There was, of course, the very famous one in 1858, but there were many others. Not many people realized that we nearly had a similar 1858 type situation in the year 110 years ago, in the year 1915, in the middle of the First World War, where Raj Bihari Bose and Sachin Sanyal, along with the Gadarites, had nearly succeeded in causing a massive uprising, which failed, but it was not a minor uprising that fizzled out. In fact, the Indian troops in Singapore captured Singapore and held it for a week. And other places also there were rebellions, but it didn't succeed. It's a different matter, it didn't succeed. Then there was an attempt, of course, which partly succeeded during the Second World War, which was the Indian National Army, which happened also in Singapore. Also, interestingly, which was that Indian National Army, the Azad Hind Fauj, was founded, interestingly, by the same person who had tried to do the first one, the First World War one, Raj Bihari Bose. Many people think that the Azad Hind Fauj was founded by Netaji. It's actually not the case. It was actually founded by the other Bose, Raj Bihari Bose. And Raj Bihari Bose, of course, by that time, he was quite old, and he handed over the responsibilities to Subhash Bose. But it was a second attempt, and it partly succeeded. But the naval mutiny is actually the final revolt that happened, and it was exactly what the revolutionaries had been attempting to do for half a century before this. And in order to understand why the naval mutiny is very, very important, in fact, I argue that it's the single most important event in our entire freedom struggle, leading to freedom. In order to understand that, you need to understand where we were in 1946. People tend to tell you only the story of a bit that happened here, but you have to know the global context and why it was so important. What is happening in 1940? The war has ended. The Allies may have won, but they are absolutely exhausted. What happens is that their troops all begin to go home. The British want to go back to their family, the British troops go home, the Australians go home, the Americans go home. And so, the only regular troops that are left in Asia are actually the soldiers of the British Indian Army. So the entire swath from Egypt all the way through the Indian subcontinent, through Burma, through Southeast Asia, all the way to southern Vietnam is held by virtue of the British Indian soldiers. Okay, so that is the context. And under them, there are these surrendered Japanese soldiers. There are very, very few Europeans, Australian, basically very, very few white soldiers left in Asia. And the British officials suddenly had this revolt happening in Mumbai. Now, look at how scary this looks to them. Because effectively, if this rebellion spreads and suddenly somebody like Netaji or somebody turns up and takes control of it, effectively the British would have fought a great war and handed the Indians a great empire. Right? And this is not some side threat, because the British Indian Army is actually revolting in many places. So, for example, the Dutch East Indies, what we now know as Indonesia, is in full rebellion because that used to be Dutch territory. It was a Dutch colony, and just before they surrendered, the Japanese handed over their guns to the local rebels. So the Indonesian rebels are fully armed, and they are trying to suppress this with Indian troops, and it is quite clear to the British that at any moment the Indian soldiers may switch sides. In fact, does happen. There is a big rebellion in Surabaya where thousands of Indonesians are killed by the British Indian Army, but hundreds of Indian soldiers also die. And the Indian soldiers are already questioning their officers that why are we dying to defend the empire of not even the British, but of their friends? Same thing happens in southern Vietnam and in many other places. So there is this simmering rebellion in the air. And this is the context in which another thing is happening. You have the Red Fort hearings of the INA soldiers. So during the war, actually, because of censorship, nobody knew about that Subhash Bose had reached the borders of India, actually entered India with an army of liberation. Now that the British make a miscalculation and they bring these soldiers to the Red Fort, it's of course in all the newspapers, and suddenly you hear that Subhash Bose had turned up with an army of liberation and entered Manipur and Nagaland. So there is a buzz in the air, and so again rebellion is in the air. So this is the context in which this naval revolt happens. And suddenly 80 ships in Mumbai harbour, 20,000 naval ratings are in open rebellion, and they take control of the ships. They arm the guns, and remember, these guys are not kids. They have just fought a war, they knew how to use those guns. So the British decide to try and intimidate them by flying some aircraft above. But do remember that these ships also have anti-aircraft, so they have to fly very high up, and they don't have proper bombers and things. So they decide that first let's take these shore establishments over, because the shore establishments were controlled by the signals guy at INS Talwar. By the way, in case you want to know where that is, when you go to Colaba and go to Chiragdin, where the shirt shop, just diagonally across there is a depot near Badwar Park. There's a truck depot. So that is the transport pool. That is actually where all of this happened. So they decide they will take that over, but more importantly, they wanted to take over the castle barracks, which is also, I think, Eisen's Angre. I mean, short walk from here. So they send in the Maratha regiment to surround it and shoot. And meanwhile, these sailors have also armed themselves. There's going to be a big confrontation between the Maratha regiment and the British Indian, the Royal Indian Navy. And so the British order the Maratha regiment to open fire. There's half an hour of firing, and nobody seems to be getting hurt on the other side. Because it's quite clear that the Marathas are deliberately shooting to miss. So they send the soldier up, the British send the British officer up to the top of the old Reserve Bank building. So not the tall one which was built later, but the old Reserve Bank building, which is also walking distance from here, to look to see what happens. So he looks around to see what is going on, and he gets promptly shot dead. It's not clear whether the sailors shot him or the Marathas shot him. So these guys are beginning to panic. So these guys are sent back to their barracks, and the Lancaster lights are sent in. And they said, let us get in more Spitfires and other things from Delhi. So the Royal Indian Air Force is asked to come fly in. And in those days, it couldn't fly directly, so they had to stop in Jodhpur to refuel. And so they stop in Jodhpur, and all of them develop engine trouble. So it was very, very clear to the British that this was a very dangerous situation. You are an inch away from full rebellion in an environment where if these guys rebel, they will not just rebel in India, they will actually have an empire from Egypt all the way to Vietnam. They will just have created a new and bigger Mauryan empire. And remember, at this juncture, they have no idea where Subhash Bose is. He could just turn up at any minute and take control of the situation. So this is the context in which the Cabinet Mission on Indian Independence is announced. It happens in the middle of the naval revolt. Which is why you have to remember it is the single most important event in our freedom struggle. And of course, once having become independent, the problem is that those who come to power as a result of this whole sequence of events do not want to advertise this. And the revolutionaries, unfortunately, do not have any senior leaders because they had all been killed. Raj Bihari Bose was dead, Subhash Bose had gone missing, Bagha Jatin, all the other, Bhagat Singh, all of them hanged, killed, shot. So the revolutionaries did not have any senior leaders, and so they were never able to make a projection of power, or instead their movement basically fritters away, and it is the Congress that comes to power. And of course the first thing they do is to simply suppress their entire history. So it is only in the late 70s or early 80s that the soldiers of the Indian National Army and of the Royal Indian Navy were recognized as freedom fighters. For the first 25 odd years of freedom, they were actually considered as mutineers, and India refused to take them back into the armed forces. This is all ironical because INA soldiers and officers fought for Pakistan in 1947-48 war in Kashmir. But India did not use them at all. Instead, the entire thing was suppressed to an extent that I, who come from a revolutionary family also, had no idea about this rebellion till the 1990s when I was living in Colaba, and I bumped into this very small memorial to them in Colaba next to the tennis club, and I wondered what on earth it was. And then I began to dig in, and I found, oh my God, this was a very, very significant event. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is why knowing something about the Navy is an important thing.